Just to run through the structure of the event, we're going to have 3 5-minute presentations. Firstly, from Declan Allison, then Mary McManus, and then Rachel Powell. We're going to go into breakout rooms for about half an hour for discussion, and then there'll be 10 minutes feedback. After that, we're really delighted to have Asad Raymond here. And Asad is going to talk about the global Green New Deal and where is hope in this difficult world at the minute. The title of his talk is really interesting. It's called Don't Look Down. Is Capitalism Killing the Planet? We'll have a panel discussion at the end with our facilitators and speakers, and we'll try and wrap up, folks, just before 6. Friends of the Earth is sort of safeguarding policies for face-to-face meetings, and I just hope quite soon we can have these meetings face-to-face. We've had 2 really difficult years, and we really need to see the whites of people's eyes again and support each other in developing a more compassionate and more collaborative economy and society with environmental justice at its heart. But the safeguarding rules that apply in a face-to-face meeting also apply here. So please treat everyone with respect, try not to talk over each other, and let's build the type of economy we want with the way we're conducting these meetings. Don't really have much else to say now. The title of the event again is Whose Economy Is It Anyway? How I Learned to Love Radical Transformative Economics, and how I love to say that title. That's twice already. I may even repeat it later on. So I think what we'll do now, we have 3 5 or 6 minute presentations. Firstly, I'm going to ask Declan Allison from Friends of the Earth Northern Ireland. Declan has been with Friends of the Earth for many years, and I'm not going to use my joke, Declan, that you've been here since Victorian times, but you're very, very welcome today, and thank you. Declan produces our policy responses on issues like climate breakdown, economics, wider environmental issues. He did a fantastic response to the environment strategy, which went in this week as well. So, and Declan has been described recently as the brain of the office, and how true is that? So over to you, Declan. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for that introduction. I should clarify that actually it was my former colleague Linda who came up with the first bit of the title. I just tacked on the other bit that I kind of riffed off Dr. Strangelove. But anyway, I'll share my screen and get on with it. So I'm going to just talk briefly about just transition in a time of climate breakdown and ecological collapse. So something nice and cheery to kick us off. So I would say there are these 3 main existential threats that we're facing. Climate breakdown is obvious, I think. Industrial farming is a major one, and something my colleague Colette could talk a lot about. And industrial fishing then. And I think it's that combination of the 3 that is leading to the ecological collapse and the breakdown in our life support systems, such as clean air, clean water, healthy food, all of that kind of stuff. So the solutions, we could end there, nice and simple. That's job done, no problem at all. Lots of renewable energy storage, smart meters to make things nice and efficient, electric cars, so we're not pumping out lots of carbon emissions from travel, and biofuels, and that solves our problem. There we go, we can all go home, that's it done. But it's maybe not as easy as that. So there are, of course, unforeseen consequences of all of these things: the extraction of rare earth minerals in China, Australia, lots of other places, the industrialization of the countryside, leading to massive air and water pollution problems, and also biodiversity. Farmland taken out of food production, that leads to food inequality, food poverty, hikes in food prices, destruction of rainforests and boglands, which are our sinks for the carbon emissions, and rapidly turning from sinks into sources, and then rights of communities being sidelined. So developments, so some of the things I mentioned in the previous slide, being pushed through without any real consideration for the impacts on local people. So they are all things that we need to be worried about. And there are things that we can do about that. The rights of communities, for one thing, right to clean air, water, and productive land, right to a functioning climate system, right to information, right to participation, right to access to justice. These are the Aarhus principles, and very important, and things that can be very easily overlooked. And something that is maybe very important for Northern Ireland in particular, equal right of appeal in planning decisions. So at the moment, only developers get to appeal if their development is not given approval, but local people who are maybe objecting to an approval, to an application, a development, don't get the right to appeal if that application goes ahead. So there's a right, there's an imbalance in the plan system there, which is, you know, part of the problem. Also integral to this will be rights of nature. And that can be broken down just in those 4 points: right to exist, right to flourish, right to evolve, right to regenerate, and the right to be restored. And that last one I think is pretty important, because it's not enough for humans just to stop doing bad stuff to the environment. We also have to be proactive in restoring it, in recognizing that we are part of the problem in the degradation, and therefore we must be part of that regeneration, part of the restoration. I'll not go through that in any kind of detail. There are just, you know, some places in the world where that right of nature has been established in law, either, you know, kind of statute law or part of constitutions or what have you. So it is a real thing. It's not just something that we have cooked up, you know, some pie in the sky idea. It is a real thing that is happening around the world. So maybe a bit then about the Northern Ireland context for some of this. I think very obviously we are a post-conflict society. We are, I would say, a traumatized people. That leaves us susceptible to exploitation by liberal or libertarian economic types, you know, predatory capitalists, that kind of stuff. The shock doctrine, we see that happening all around the border of Northern Ireland, and even stretching into it. We see with the you know, minerals exploitation, with industrial farming, with more and more energy projects coming in. You know, unconventional oil and gas storage, the oil storage, gas storage caverns in Larnloch, these kinds of things. So it's kind of any job will do. We must have employment under any circumstances. That's the sort of principle there behind the shock doctrine. Something as a post-conflict society we are perhaps susceptible to. Austerity, you know, it's an ongoing thing with the Tory government, but you know, us being on the fringes of the UK economy, maybe it makes us a little more susceptible to that. And Brexit, of course, and the Northern Ireland Protocol and the consequences of that. I kind of debated with myself about what image to use for Brexit. I was going to go for the sunlit uplands, but I decided to go for the unicorn instead. So they're the kind of issues that Northern Ireland specifically are facing that could leading us, I would say, to be susceptible to some of these shock doctrine tactics. And so just to finish off then, I would say any transition that isn't an equitable one isn't a solution. So all solutions must be just and equitable, otherwise they shouldn't really be considered. So I'll leave it there.
Declan, that was incredible. Like a magisterial analysis, and you covered shock doctrines, Brexit, post-conflict society issues, all within the allocated 5 minutes. So thanks also for keeping the time. I'm going to introduce now Rachel Powell. Rachel's talk is called "The Climate Crisis as a Feminist Issue and Creating a Caring Economy." And Rachel is a women's sector lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency and the chair of the Women's Policy Group in Northern Ireland. And formerly, Rachel has been a human rights officer for the Human Rights Consortium. Folks, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm James Orr, and I work for Friends of the Earth. And also keep popping your names and where you're calling in from into the chat box if you wish, or raise any issues. So I'll just pass over to Rachel now.
Thank you, James. So yes, my name is Rachel, and I want to touch briefly today on our work in the Women's Policy Group in developing our Feminist Recovery Plan, which calls for the development of a caring economy and the recognition of the climate crisis as a feminist issue. So for a bit of background on how we developed this plan, very early on in the pandemic, around April 2020, we started to become increasingly concerned about the disproportionate impact the pandemic was having on women, economically, socially, and in terms of health. And primarily, we were concerned that if the government didn't address this disproportionate impact on women, that any progress women had achieved will be lost, and the consequences could last for decades. We then looked at the climate crisis on top of this, and how, again, if we weren't incorporating gender equality priorities into this, that really it was a recipe for disaster. So we decided to create a comprehensive roadmap to recovery, radical, transformative policy recommendations for our society, and that these would not only mitigate against the impact of the ongoing pandemic, but also address the structural and systemic discrimination and pre-existing inequalities facing women and marginalized groups to create a fairer and more caring economy. So the plan itself is 6 pillars: economic justice, health, social justice, culture, Brexit and the Bill of Rights, and then international best practice. And the plan itself then was developed by 35 women who are policy experts across 26 different organisations in Northern Ireland. So it certainly was a collaborative effort, and I know some of those women are on this call today. We originally launched in July 2020 and then decided to relaunch in July 21. Because despite providing all of this evidence and an actual roadmap on recovery, the executive was just continuing to totally ignore any of these recommendations. So for us, economic justice was by far the biggest pillar within the plan, and we made a range of policy recommendations to address the fact that our current capitalist economic structures were completely undermining and undervaluing all sectors that are seen as women's work or were women dominated, despite the fact that they are the core to our economy. And just for some context on some of the Northern Ireland stats, so women account for 79% of health and social care workers, 69% of all carers, 82% of part-time workers in unstable working conditions, 70% of workers who weren't eligible for sick pay. The childcare sector, 48% of those earn below a real living wage, which is predominantly women workforce. As well as the fact that women are vastly underrepresented in all political structures. Furthermore, 31% of women are considered economically inactive, and we very much dispute this term because we do not believe that being forced out of the formal labour market for family and home commitments means that you have no contribution to make towards society. And as well as this, 80% of people displaced by the climate crisis worldwide are women. So clearly the economic structures that were in place before the pandemic were failing women, and this was being exacerbated as COVID continued. And for us, we believe that it was very much going to get worse if we don't seriously reassess our economic structures and priorities. The existing economic world order forces us to live in a system which treats women and nature as commodities to extract from, yet by doing so completely exhausts the base, which is women's labour and natural resources, which it depends on for survival. So to quote the Women's Environmental Network, which we very much relied on as well for this research, paid and unpaid care work are integral parts of a transition to a green economy and are, for the most part, already low carbon. The systemic lack of recognition and investment in social infrastructure has created industries in which small amounts of investment can create significant returns in both employment opportunities and service improvement. From a feminist perspective, it is absolutely essential to balance the emphasis on decarbonising the economy with the stated commitment to redressing social injustice. And this requires both awareness of and strategies for changing gender norms and stereotypes. And for us, we firmly believe that the care sector is an already existing green sector that needs to be incorporated into any climate change planning. And there's evidence that this works. The Women's Budget Group based in GB have research that indicates a 2% GDP investment into care, which can include social care, childcare, and parental leave, creates double the amount of jobs for women and almost as many jobs for men as the same investment in construction. Investment in free universal childcare especially returns almost all of its initial investment. And the care industry is 30% less polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than the construction industry, and the education industry is 62% less polluting. So this was really the basis for us incorporating the climate crisis throughout our feminist recovery plan. And you'll know about the 2 different climate change bills going through the Assembly. We very much are in favour of the cross-party bill, as I'm sure most of the people on this call today will be. And we believe that robust legislation on this issue absolutely needs to look for a fair and just transition alongside an economic strategy that will support clean and inclusive growth and create jobs as a part of a feminist Green New Deal. Finally, just wanted to highlight the 5 main suggestions and recommendations within this. Is for investment in social infrastructure, green jobs, which looks beyond simply pushing women into STEM, looking at already existing women-dominated sectors, sharing care to redress gender inequality, democracy and ownership, and international responsibilities. And to that end, I would just like to conclude by saying then that our evidence submission, which was a summary of all of this information to the Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee on the Cross-Party Climate Change Bill, we suggested an amendment. We called for gender proofing to be incorporated into every stage of the bill. Northern Ireland will be the first place in the world to incorporate gender equality into their climate legislation, and that was successfully passed by the committee, and we hope it will make it through to the final stages of the bill. So this would very much put Northern Ireland on the map, and I believe it's one of the benefits to us being so far behind when it comes to climate change legislation and anything to do with gender inequality, is that we can potentially do it better. It's just a start, but we have a long, long way to go. And efforts to address the climate crisis and decarbonize the economy must be done in tandem with efforts to address gender inequality. But gender equality should not be at the expense of climate justice, and climate justice should not be achieved at the expense of gender inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was just uplifting and inspiring. You know, the idea that, you know, the climate bills could have gender equality amendments put in is just fantastic, you know, and thanks for raising the issue of the climate bills as well too. We're going through it at the minute. One's pretty crap and one's pretty good, but that's a story for another day. Thank you, Rachel, and also thanks for sticking to time. I want to introduce Mary now. Mary McManus is going to speak on community wealth building, a common sense approach to local economic development. Good to see you, Mary. Thank you for coming. Mary spent 24 years in the independent advice sector. In 2020, she completed an award-winning master's research at Queen's into the anti-poverty potential of community wealth building. She's now looking at, which I think is fantastic, looking at systemic solutions to create a fair society and a fair planet. So you're very welcome, Mary. Thanks very much. We're all on time, so no pressure on you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. My love for radical transformative economics, community wealth building in particular, was born out of my desire to do something about the awful growing poverty I was witnessing through my work in a welfare rights centre in Inner East Belfast. Poverty is not new. The pre-pandemic world was one of gross and constantly increasing inequality, as typified by the rise of food banks. It was clear we needed a different system that ensures everyone has enough and that we operate within planetary boundaries. We must start to realise that the problem is not poverty, it is wealth. We must appreciate that we are blessed with considerable wealth, but it is not shared and equally distributed. To ensure a more equal distribution, we need a transformative economic model such as community wealth building, which is also known as the Preston model due to the city's pioneering works. Community wealth building is a common sense approach to local economic development that is centred on ensuring that the wealth already in a place is kept circulating rather than leaking away. It is also a more democratic approach that aims to put more ownership, more control, and more of the benefits in the hands of local people. Very importantly, Preston has given us proof of concept. Between 2013 and 17, this approach in Preston led to the creation of 4,000 new real living wage jobs, a reduction in unemployment from 6.5% to 3.1% in those years, a 10% rise in 16 to 24-year-olds in Preston receiving an NVQ level 3 qualification, which led to Preston being named the most improved city in the UK in 2018 and moving out of the top 20% most deprived cities. And it has inspired numerous other cities and places to adopt the approach. The Scottish Government hoped to pass a Community Wealth Building Act in this parliamentary term. The Welsh Government is exploring the approach, and here the Minister for Communities has committed to embedding community wealth building into her department's development and spend priorities. So how does it work in practice? Local anchor institutions are key to the approach. These are public institutions such as councils, universities, and health trusts. They are called anchors as they are not likely to pick up sticks and move elsewhere like a private company. They employ large numbers of people and have significant amount of assets and spending power. Community wealth building has 5 principles. The first is the fair employment and just labour markets. This means anchors paying the real living wage, having progression routes, and targeting recruitment at lower income areas, improving the prospects of local people and local economies. For example, Preston became a real living wage employer. And just to note, the Northern Ireland Assembly also became accredited as a real living wage employer last November. The second pillar is progressive procurement of goods and services. This is about local anchor institutions collaborating to ensure that how they procure services and goods supports the local economy. In Preston, 6 anchors analysed their combined procurement spend of 750 million and discovered that 458 million was leaking out of their local economy. They broke down their contracts to ensure that local small, medium enterprises and cooperatives could bid. They introduced social clauses into tenders and had meet the buyer events to support local businesses to tender for contracts. This relocalized 274 million back into the local economy and allowed Preston to achieve the outcomes I already mentioned. And it has also helped to create a more resilient economy, as in December 2020, Preston had a furlough rate of 6.9% compared with the UK average of 12.5%. So this leads to the third pillar, plural ownership of the economy. Preston Council have not only been supporting local small, medium enterprises, they are also creating more democratically owned businesses by developing cooperatives. They're invested in a cinema and restaurant complex, which will be owned by the council, ensuring good working conditions and that local people benefit from the profits. North Ayrshire are developing municipally owned solar farms. Small, medium enterprises, cooperatives, and municipally owned businesses all help lock wealth into place and stop leaking it away to private shareholders, which is financially generative for the local economy. The fourth pillar is socially just use of land and property. Anchor institutions own a significant amount of land and assets. In Belfast, for example, 40% of the land is owned by anchor institutions, with Belfast City Council and the Harbour Commission owning 34% of them. In the community wealth building model, these assets are treated as part of our common wealth, and their function and ownership provides a social and financial benefit for citizens. This can involve placing an asset such as a building in community control through a social asset transfer, for example. So the final pillar is making financial power work for local places. This is about increasing flows of investment within local economies by harnessing and recirculating the wealth that already exists, as opposed to attracting capital. So for example, instead of savings being placed in a private bank where shareholders benefit, they could be placed in a mutually owned bank that would support local businesses. There are plans underway in many regions of the UK to develop mutual banks. Here in Northern Ireland, there is a campaign called the Northern Mutual, and Bridget can tell us a little bit about that, or perhaps put a link in. Bridget Meehan, who's here from that campaign. How are public sector pension funds invested? Could they be invested in a way that supports local climate action, for example? In Preston, they invested 100 million of local authority pension funds in student houses to benefit their community rather than a project far away. Some of the places that have comprehensively adopted community wealth building as their approach to social and economic justice are also using it to achieve environmental justice and a just transition. Preston, North Ayrshire, and Newham are all good examples, and I'll put some links into the chat. Community wealth building is a very doable, common sense approach to transformative economics that allows us to imagine a new normal where we use the wealth we already have in place to create a fairer society and achieve a just transition. So I'll just leave you with poverty and lack of money are not the issue. The wealth and the lack of its distribution is the issue, and the key to allowing us to create a more equitable and achieve a more equitable society and achieve a just transition. Thank you.
Mary, that was just brilliant. Thank you. And thanks for the really positive ideas. You know, one thing I've been thinking about during your chat there was Tony Weeks' advice to me 25 years ago. Just don't concentrate on what's wrong, but let's concentrate on the solution. So thanks for doing it. And to Declan, Rachel, and Mary, you know, you were all very concise. You did exactly what we wanted, was to set a platform for some really inspirational ideas. So hats off to you. I just want to introduce now the breakout sessions. We're going to go into random breakout groups, and we have a number of facilitators. We have Bridget Meehan, that you mentioned, Mary. Bridget's been working on social and economic justice issues for many years. From Queen's University, we have Sean Farron and John Barry, the Young Turk and the Old Guard, you might say. And also my long-standing friend and I would have to say mentor, Tony Weeks. So it's a pleasure to introduce the 4 facilitators. After half an hour's discussion, we're going to come back for 10 minutes or so, and the 4 folks will give a 2 or 3 minute summary of how the conversation went. So over to everyone now. Thanks for staying with us. And we're just going to pass on now for a little bit of facilitator feedback. Maybe if Sean, Bridget, John, and Tony could, maybe in that order, if that's okay, could just give us a couple of minutes each. That would be great before we go to Assad.
Great, yeah. So we have a manifesto now to change the world. So we'll run through the sort of main points we've covered. Yeah, we sort of talked about some of the obstacles that are in the way of, I mean, there's a lot of agreement about a lot of these ideas, but the obstacles that are in the way by way of institutions and the nature of our politics, of allowing these ideas to take root. So of course, the basis of identity for so much of the politics that blocks these material concerns, even though they are quite popular. Although there was agreement that there seems to be shifting sands on that, and particularly younger generations want to see these ideas and heterodox economic ideas take root, and these material and ecological concerns are becoming a priority. So yeah, that's right. I mean, direct democracy, a realignment from the corridors of power where these things are now, because the ideas are known, they're not brand new, and though they do seem to be growing a wee bit in popularity, they're more in vogue in recent years. They have been around for a long time, and so if we had more locuses of direct democracy in communities, we'd be able to implement them faster and more effectively. And that was the last point we touched on there. I mean, a lot of these ideas of community wealth building and more ecologically based and compatible economies, they are slowly taking root, and there seems to be a shift towards in councils and in the assembly and so on, of these more progressive ideas. But there is a competency issue as well, and there's also just the myopia of politics. So for example, when's the last time, I mean, it's just the last thing we talked about literally in the last 60 seconds, when's the last time Stormont was given 145, 150 million pound as there was for the Spend Local scheme? And what did we do with that money? Not you know, capitalize a community bank or invest in community infrastructure and so on, but we pissed it into the market through, you know, to allow us to go to B&Q or McDonald's, wherever it might have been, and spend that sort of money. So, you know, we're covering, I suppose, a lot of big themes there, but we looked at the obstacles and then also looked at, I suppose, the positives and how we can try and shift that.
Class, Sean. Thanks for that feedback. Much appreciated. Bridget, are you okay to say a few words now?
Yeah.
Your group?
This could be a bit garbled because I was trying to take notes, and I don't know how successfully I did that as I went along, but we were talking, and I suppose one of the things that came out is that the alternative to capitalism and neoliberalism is something that we sort of almost are conditioned into believing that there can't be an alternative. So Tina is a very pervasive idea, but there are alternatives, and you know, some of them were talked about today, and participatory economics. I had mentioned that as well as an alternative. We were saying that many people don't believe the system is broken. So that's a problem, that's a barrier to making change. But there are many others that do recognize that it is broken. The thing is about how we move from where we are now to where we want to be. So that journey. How do we take that journey? What are the steps along that? And that maybe is quite daunting for people. Where to even begin and how to move along. But we recognize that there are things that are happening already on the ground. There's like what we call non-reformist reforms, the kind of reforms and changes that are actually trying to dismantle the current system and take us into, prepare us for an alternative, that those are happening, and that things like Green New Deal and community wealth building model, those are those kind of reforms that are helping us on that journey to a just transition. We talked about how corporations just seem to have a lack of morals. They're just such a blight, but we need to call them out, and we need to find alternatives like cooperatives. There's probably an education but needed as well, just to get people up to speed on where things are at, to get them into that headspace that we need this kind of change, and we need it quickly. And it was considered that storytelling and movies were a good way to kind of educate people as well as books and articles. And just the last bit was, that there is a lot happening. There are a lot of grassroots activism and initiatives going on. They just don't get a lot of support from government. Government, it seems to be just so far behind where the grassroots are at. And these groups don't get a lot of kind of publicity either from the media. So that's why a lot of the time people don't even know there's a lot going on and what kind of impact it's having. But yeah, so that pretty much sums up what we had talked about.
Wow, Mary, thanks. And thanks for that term, non-reformist reforms. It's something that really struck home with me there. I hadn't heard it before, and I'll be using it tomorrow morning, I'm sure. Thanks so much for your feedback. I think I'll just go now to John, if that's okay, John.
Yeah, well, our group can trump Sean Fearon's. We've created the Belfast Green Commune, thanks to one of our members, Trevor. And certainly for me, if I could summarize our discussion, it's an old kind of left progressive slogan of agitate, and organize. But I think out of our discussion, while still holding that they're really important issues, we need to also provide. So educate, agitate, organize, and provide in terms of trying to come up with practical ways of meeting the real material needs of our citizens and communities. So, we had Chris and Declan in our group, and indeed Simon, offering examples of very practical ways, whether it's the repair cafe, the refill quarter, the Belfast 2 library, or challenging the kind of Deliveroo digging gig economy, if you want to use those terms. In terms of, again, that issue of maybe bypassing politicians, councils, and governments. A lot of the stuff we need to do just requires people to wake up, get angry, maybe not look up or look down, but certainly, to anticipate what Assad will, perhaps talk about, is to see that there are real alternatives. That, too often I think people who are not in, our group, and I'm imagining most people on the call today, we all have a kind of a similar kind of, mind. It's how do we convince, I always think, Mammy Barry, my mother, who's a working class, tough woman from Dublin, and thinks most of the stuff I come up with is absolute pie in the sky nonsense, utopian, woke, urban, educated, middle class stuff. She wants to know how she's going to have her electricity bill paid for, where's the food going to come from? And certainly James made the point in our group that if we want to focus our energies, I think particularly now with the energy crisis of many hard-pressed households now, facing the horrible heat scenario, and there are ways in which we could start looking at providing energy and certainly food. And Chris made a really important, and I think it'd be quite inspiring to try and do this. If we were to get 1,000 people in Belfast to commit to spending whatever it is, 20-40% of their food shopping to support local. I mean, again, Chris suggested this would be about £500,000 a year, but it's those type of very practical but still subversive ways of moving beyond the sloganeering and slagging off the evils of the current system, which we all are very well aware of, So it's about seeing that there's a variety of, whether it's trade union focus that Declan in our group was making a case for, the transition town movement that Chris was mentioned and I've been involved with over the years. But I do like that idea of relocalizing our focus and bypassing maybe the structures of power, because certainly, just to finish, and this is my own view, we are far too polite when it comes to demanding change. We think if we take a ticket, we vote for somebody, we submit to a consultation document and try and get involved in the existing system, that somehow that's going to create change. And the question I would leave you all with, well, what is your theory of change? How do we all think that change actually comes about in society? I think that liberal, democratic, reformist approach is not only a waste of energy, it's completely broken at this stage. So we need to think about more radical, but not radical in the usual kind of shouty, lefty, sloganeering sense, although that's all good stuff, as many of you know. I'm well practiced at it over the years, but come up with real practical solutions on the ground. So I think that is what I hope is a kind of broad summary of our very local, very practical, and I suppose that idea of it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, that we shouldn't be waiting around for, just do it and get on with it. It's way past time for us to do that. So anyway, here ended the shouty Bob Geldof secular sermon.
Thanks, John. Always brilliant, always inspiring. Yeah, let's have more disruptors and animators or animateurs or whatever they're called. Tony, have you got a few words?
Well, we seem to spend some time on the way in which language seems to hold us back in some ways. The words like economically active as a kind of general purpose criticism, you're either active or you're inactive, and if you're inactive, you're somehow not doing the right thing. And that led on, I think, to exploring a little the word work and what it really involves, and the need to drop the meaning of the word work to inevitably mean paid employment. We didn't get on to, well, we did in one sense get on to the fact that much work in the sense of effort to achieve something worthwhile in the world was carried on by women. And that's totally neglected in the typical framing of economic policy. I did raise the point, but I think there were too much possibly to be discussed. If we turn the way framing policy away from economic growth as a principal objective, what about identifying some of our needs? And that brought us, I think, briefly to the notion that security was an important aspect. And that would cover things like poverty, homelessness, and that kind of thing. But we then moved very briefly into the notion of the basic income idea, and how some years ago, if you dared speak those words, you would immediately be jumped on and said something like, well, if we had one of that, if we had that, no one would get out of bed. To which the standard response developed in my mind, are you speaking about yourself? And the answer was, no, of course I'm not. It's the others that do this. But there is this corrosive, almost built-in reaction to things, which I think in turn flows from another rant of mine, which I think is the term, well, summed up in the term economic illiteracy, a really powerful grip that it has upon us, extending from the ordinary people who fear to challenge the orthodoxy, feeling that you have to have, as I've read somewhere, the brain the size of Canada if you want to take it on. Then there's the politicians who feed it down to us and say, look what we've achieved, how much economic growth we've had, aren't you all the better for it? To which we need to question very carefully what we mean. Do you mean the manufacture of arms is a good way of seeing us forward? And then I'll come back in a moment, I think, to you, John, if I may. The way academic teaching in the field, certainly of economics and its related subjects, simply perpetuates something which I first encountered as an undergraduate student some 40 odd years ago. It's the same old rubbish. And you daren't speak, although some students are speaking out about it. But on the whole, you're fed something like dogma, like, you know, one learned from the time one perhaps was a member of a church in some way, and this is what the pastor told you and you didn't argue about it. And at that point, I think we got the dreaded message that says your time's up. But it did strike me that the task which you've taken on, James, or to try and enlighten people and give them confidence is one which is a mega task. And good luck to you and good luck to us all who are trying to do it. End of rant.
Rather on, Tony, you always focus on what can be done rather than the negativity, and thanks for that. I'm going to just shift now, folks. I'm conscious of time and I'm conscious of people's bellies, and you know, there's a certain amount of attrition in this event. So I want to introduce Asad Rehman. Asad's talk is called "Don't Look Down: Is Capitalism Killing the Planet?" Asad is the executive director of War and Want, which works for a just world through its mission to fight against the root causes of poverty, inequality, and climate injustice. He's also co-coordinator of the Global Green New Deal, has been involved for decades in the anti-war movement, anti-racism movement. And honestly, Asad, if it wasn't for your TV contributions during the COP26 farrago, I think I would have gone insane. So thank you very much for that as well. So I just want to say thank you, Asad. And during actually the chat, if we have about 15 minutes at the end to question the panelists or raise ideas, and the facilitators as well. So if anybody wants to pop some stuff in the chat, that would be great. Anyway, over to you, Asad. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and comrades, sisters, brothers. Always a real pleasure to join you and all these amazing panelists and discussion that we've had. And just to also say that War on Want is very different from the War on Want that you may know in the north of Ireland. Whilst we used to share the same name, we're a very different organisation. I want to just start, James, you just reminded me about the climate summit. So I want to just cast our minds back to that just before the climate summit. If we remember, world was reeling from summer of devastating climate impacts, floods, fires, droughts, literally every corner of the world. Urgency of climate crisis across our TV screens on a daily basis. It seemed, of course, that finally, to many, that it began to dawn that the climate crisis wasn't something that was going to happen in the future in our children's or grandchildren's lifetime, but was already here. And of course, recognizing that, you know, overwhelming the impact was on those people in the global south who, as we know, their lives matter less. We have the publication of the IPCC Working Group 1 report on the climate science set out. Impacts are happening faster than predicted, more severe than the models have predicted. Scientists took to the airwaves, ringing the alarm bells. We're standing on the edge of the precipice with the very future of humanity hanging in the balance. And they reiterated there is no safe temperature level, and it's deadly for many, but it's critical to limit temperature levels to well below the 1.5 degree guardrail, and reminded us that a carbon budget, even for a 2 in 3 chance of preventing a breach, was likely to be passed by 2030, and even the way more dangerous 2 degree target was at risk, possibly even by 2030 at its earliest. Yeah, as we know, 2021 saw global emissions set to rise to the highest level on record, and that with all the promises to act, even if all the current actions are met, and let's remind ourselves, of course, that our own government likes to announce targets, but then fails to meet them, that it would deliver a temperature level rise of above 3 degrees. So we had renewed public attention, significant media focus, warnings by climate scientists, and even the beginning of a broader movement for climate justice that gone beyond traditional environmentalism. All, at least on paper, seem to have created the perfect combination to deliver the action it needed. Indeed, if you remember the opening of the climate talks, we even had our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, say, we're at 1 minute to midnight, and promised this would be the COP that delivered on both the 1.5 degree goal, where rich countries met their financial pledge from 2009 for 100 billion for the global south, and that those already facing the huge and devastating impacts would be given the support they needed. Then, of course, he probably fell asleep in the plenary, caught a private jet back to London, his main goal met, a platform to rub shoulders with world leaders, part of the sort of rebrand of global Britain. Or as his own ministers more accurately said, Empire 2.0. So we all know that the COP failed both people and planet. And of course, it ended with rich countries refusing to do their fair share of effort, blaming others, and seeking to shift the need to act to those least responsible for this crisis. Temperature levels set for at least a 2.7 degree warming, with frankly unimaginable consequences. And that again is if all the pledges are met. Lots of warm words about the need to act, but as the UK's own weak and unjust target demonstrated, not only lacking concrete policies and plans to deliver this deadly and unfair 2050 goal, but like many at the same time, expanding fossil fuels, signing trade agreements that lock in secret corporate courts, that allow corporations to sue governments if they take action on climate that threatens their profits. And I'll put a link into the chat in a second. Just as an aside, there's currently about 1,200 live ISDS cases going on, and corporations have about a 50% success rate in these secret courts, and they're ruling against governments if they put plans in place to move away from coal or fracking or take action on climate. And we saw at the end of the COP, countries said, rich countries, we regret that we couldn't meet the 100 billion, even at the very same time as the US government just by itself was approving a military budget of 870 billion, let alone, of course, as we remember, the 16 trillion that was found within days to bail out the banks, and of course, the decade of austerity for working people in the global north. And even that paltry 100 billion finance goal, we all know, is a drop in the ocean compared to the trillions that are needed. And again, as the COP ended, we saw rich countries led by the US, but backed by the UK and the EU, refuse to even discuss what we do about the huge impacts that were all happening. They promised a phone line, but no help at the end of when it's answered. And all of that, of course, because they said that their red line was that they refused to become liable for the impacts that they're responsible for, that they're already being felt, and as we know, are in the future likely to spiral out of control. What we did see, of course, is the UK government provide platform after platform for big business. We had Amazon and we had bankers such as Mark Carney talk about how the private sector would deliver where governments were unable. And Carney was at least honest enough to admit that the trillions in private climate finance that they were talking about were all about maximizing the opportunities for the private sector to profit from offsets, carbon markets, and net zero, and very little about, of course, tackling energy poverty, tackling the climate crisis, or ensuring that everyone has the right to live with dignity. Now, the main outcome of the COP, and one of the most dangerous outcomes, was the successful capture of climate policy by this net zero logic. And for those of you who don't know what net zero means, it basically means we can carry on polluting, turn up the temperature, and sometime in the future we'll invent technology which will magically suck this carbon from the atmosphere, and then we can try and dial down the temperature again. And I'm sure every one of us have watched Don't Look Down. To me, it's the equivalent of the policy to try and mine that asteroid for profit rather than stop the asteroid itself. So why did it fail? And we saw quite a lot of people distraught and blaming the COP process itself, and even going as far as saying we shouldn't be having COP processes. And of course, it's right, we should be asking, why is it we've had climate conferences in the 1970s? The Climate Convention was signed in 1992. Why have we had 26 conferences of the parties, yet we haven't made any meaningful impact on the crisis? And of course, the answer is, in all of these situations, is that there is always the fundamental question of power. Who has it? Who doesn't? How do we build our collective power, and how do we express it? And we know, all of us on this call, that any successful social transformation requires a vision of the world that we want to create, concrete policy demands that are to the scale and urgency of the crisis, but also connect with where people are, and of course, fundamentally building power. And it's right, and I think we should recognize that the climate movement has undergone a profound shift in recent years. The fact that we're having this conversation where decades, issues of justice, equity, racism, inequality, as well as the agency demands of movements in the global south, or what I would call, other parts of our movement, have been deliberately marginalized and in fact actively opposed by mainstream environmentalism, with this dominant framework and theory of change, seeing climate only through the lens of carbon reductions, relegating these questions of power in the economy, and also focusing primarily on strategies which said insider advocacy, tweak policies that would not challenge the status quo. And I think all of our collective work, and really amazing to hear everything from the feminist transition to the work that people are doing at the local level. We are seeing a profound shift, and I put a link in about our call for a radical global Green New Deal and say, absolutely, we have to base ourselves on 4 key tests. How do we guarantee absolutely everyone the right to live with dignity and harmony with our planet? And that does mean, of course, a fair share response to limiting temperatures below 1.5. That's a real zero goal by 2030 for countries like the UK. And again, I'll put a link into the chat. The actual fair share of the UK of responsibility of the UK, if it was actually doing its fair share of effort, would be minus 200% by 2030. And that means simply that energy, food, water can only be considered as part of the commons. They have to be shared equitably and under democratic control. It's not possible to transform our energy or our food systems whilst they're controlled by corporations whose primary goal is, of course, maximizing profit. We know we need to see a massive reduction in energy use by some, and at the same time tackling energy poverty for the majority. Yet fossil fuel continues to increase even as the percentage of renewables does. So overall, this won't be fixed by simply greening our electricity supply. It means much more profound questions about what is productive energy, what is sustainable energy, and how is our economies powered. Tackling global inequality and poverty. We know that in the global south, 3.5 billion people survive on the equivalent of $5 a day, $5.50 a day. That's not $5.50, but what the equivalent would buy you in the US. Half the world is without access to electricity or clean cooking. 2 billion people are going hungry. 1.7 billion people lack housing. 1 billion people without access to fresh water. I could go on and on. And of course, here in the UK as well, 4.5 million people relying on food banks, highest level of inequality since Victorian times, and more people worrying about whether there should be heating or eating. So that means we don't just need a just transition for workers in the fossil fuel sector in the global north, but a much more profound justice transition to build this care economy, which can guarantee living wages for everyone. So I always say, if we can demand £15 an hour in the UK, we should be demanding $15 a day in the global south of social protection and universal public services, such as health, education, and housing. And of course, staying within planetary limits means we can't mine or consume our way out of this crisis. We need to really put well-being and end to sustainable and unequitable growth at the center of our strategies. And that green transition in the global north can't be built on a new wave of green colonialism. And again, I'll put a link into the chat about just the scale of the materials that the global north is expected to extract from the global south. Already the OECD predicts a doubling of material use when we need to reduce it massively. And of course, none of that is possible without recognizing we have a global financial system that I would say isn't broken. It was rigged and it was designed to extract wealth from the poorest. And to do that, we have to recognize all of the embedded systems of injustice, racism, patriarchy, and racialized capitalism, which I'll come on to in a second, that are embedded into our global and political systems. And we need financial flows at the scale commensurate with needs. And that, of course, we can do through global wealth taxes, corporate taxes, enter forced privatization, and to the deregulated economy. But the answer simply isn't about increasing financial flows. We all know for every $1 that flows in aid from the global north to the south in all flows, $24 flows the opposite direction. So understanding this moment of these crises and of the intersectional nature of it and how this fight for climate justice and how we respond to this moment of crisis is really profound. And the scale is staggering, right? We know yes, we've spent about 16 trillion recently in the global north on its COVID response. Less than 2% of that actually to the low carbon economy of the future. We know that the multiple crises are spiraling out of control. We've got 1 million people on the brink of starvation in Madagascar. We saw India's 5th biggest city running out of fresh water. We've got 40% of India's predicted of 1.2 billion people predicted to be without access to fresh water in the coming decades. And just one storm in the Caribbean wiping out development gains of decades, a loss of 240% of GDP. We are entering, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights said, a climate apartheid of the world, where the rich will use wealth to seek safety whilst leaving the poor left to die. So at the heart of this, responding to this multiple crisis, I would say is, as a famous politician once said, it's all about the economy, stupid. So the question we have to ask ourselves is absolutely, can capitalism drive the scale of transition in the time frame possible? And I just want to say something about capitalism, or I would argue racialized capitalism, and why it's really got to be at the center of us challenging this dominant economic and political system. We know that the logic of what is the past is as present today as it was then. And as when the global north was putting people in chains and sending gunboats to eviscerate people and their economies. And this notion of the sacrificing of both people and exploitation of resources as central to the accumulation of capital, of unequal and unjust economic growth, really is part of this notion that joins the dots. And if we had more time, I'd love to talk to you about everything from the doctrine of discovery to the Enlightenment and how it's all connected to today's neoliberal capitalist system. But we all can recognize that at its core, the idea that the lives of poor people, Black, brown, Indigenous people are expendable. You may have seen this Guardian article and the writing by Amitav Ghosh recently, who said, for 2 centuries, European colonialists tore across the world, viewing nature and land as something inert to be conquered and consumed without limits, and Indigenous people as savages whose knowledge of nature was worthless and who needed to be erased. It was this settler colonial worldview of just accumulate, consume, has got us where we want to. So I have got, sorry, I just want to do a time check. How long have I got, James?
Yeah, like maybe another 5 minutes, Assad, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm going to speed. Sorry, I'm speed. Okay, so I wanted to just maybe say a little bit about this politics of this sacrificing of the global south, and how, not just how it underpins the capitalist system, but our own history in the economy of the UK. There is a reason why the UK is the 5th largest economy in the world, and has been the driving force of capitalist industrialization and neoliberalism. And that's not because Britain has a peculiar trait of ingenuity, invention, or intelligence, as some of we're told by some of our ministers, but because we all know Britain was a singularly efficient and brutal engine of imperial exploitation of both people and resources, both of the global south and, of course, there in the country of Ireland. And we can talk about, if we had time, I'd love to talk to you about how slavery financed and set the scene for England's industrial revolution. Some between 1761 and 1808, British traders were responsible for enslaving just under 1.5 million people of African descent, and they pocketed what is about 8 billion in today's money. And those slave colonies, how they supplied the UK with sugar, tobacco, coffee, chocolate, and of course cotton, and how that enriched the slave owners and merchants and made them the richest people in 18th century Britain. And that profit was what was used to build the roads, canals, universities, the banks, including Barclays, and of course, more importantly, the investments that went into the British economy. It said that something like, in the 1770s, of the total investments, something like, over 95% came from slave-based commercial profits. And, and that, of course, was not just about the past, it is also about the present. I'm originally I was born in Pakistan, originally from the Indian subcontinent, just from India alone, it's now calculated Britain looted nearly 45 trillion between 1765 and 1938. And just putting that in perspective, that 45 trillion is about 17 times more than the total GDP of the UK. And of course, said the sun never never set on the British Empire. I always say that's because God was scared of what Britain would steal in the darkness. But they did have a master class in robbery, right, on a grand scale by rigging the trading system. So not just of the extraction of resources, but India's share of global GDP, for example, was about 24% before the British Raj. It was 4% after it. And it said that the cost of every British war of conquest outside of the Indian borders was charged wholly or mainly to Indian revenues. And it's not just that, but Britain then used that flow of tributes from not just India, but from the colonial empire to finance the expansion of capitalism in Europe, to Canada, Australia. So you can say not only the industrialization of Britain, but of all the West was facilitated by the extraction of and I could go on chapter and verse about, you know, that colonization, as Walter Rodney said, of Africa and other parts of the world, formed this indispensable link in this chain of events, which made possible the technological transformation of the base of European capitalism. But that's not just about the past. Even today, you know, we have a report, and I can share a link about new colonialism, showing that Britain's scramble for Africa's energy and mineral resources show that 101 British companies supported by the UK government collectively control more than 1 trillion of Africa's mineral and resources, more than the combined GDPs of every sub-Saharan African country. And even today, London, which powers 22% of the British economy, it benefits from this web of extraction and exploitation. A third of all the values on the shares in the City of London come from the extractive industries, the very industries that need to be shut down as part of the climate emergency. And of course, how do they do that? Imperialism, violent overthrow and assassination of leaders such as Allende. But as the new president of Chile said recently, you know, Chile was the cradle of neoliberalism. It will also be its graveyard. But yesterday, you know, was also the anniversary of the murder of Patrice Lumumba in Congo by US, UK and Belgian interests. And not just murdered, but if you remember, his body dissolved in acid, so there would be no physical remains of Lumumba as they imposed the dictatorship of Mobutu to allow the West free reign to extract its resources. We could go about Mossadegh in Iran, Albenz in Guatemala and countless others. And what did they all have in common? That they rejected the control by Western multinationals of their resources and looked to invest in health and education and build sustainable economies. And, you know, and that system isn't simply an historic system. Since 2012, you know, developing countries received about 1.3 trillion in aid, investment, income from abroad. That's everything together. At the same time, 3.3 trillion flowed out of them. So you say developing countries sent 2 trillion more to the rest of the world than they reserve. If you add those up, since 1980, it's an incredible 16.3 trillion has flown from the global south to the global north. And again, that's about 8 times the GDP of the UK. And so I want to end by just rushing through this. If we're ever in doubt about the ability of our capitalist system to be able to respond to this moment of crisis, we need to just remind ourselves of the claim uttered by the richest countries in the world at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. No one is safe until we're all safe. And of course, we all know it exposed the inequalities and injustices in our own societies, low-paid workers, frontline workers paying the heaviest price. But we also know of what it did in terms of the global south, in leaving workers destitute as factories shut down, millions plunged into poverty and multinational turning on their back. And what was the lowest hanging fruit that could have been addressed? Of course, it's vaccines and treatments being made available to all. And the UK, like all the rich countries, continue to block that to protect the profits of big pharmaceutical companies. So the idea that even when you know that eradicating the coronavirus is essential for the safety of your own citizens, you're still putting the dominant frame is that the free market will deliver and is the answer instead of public services such as health or government intervention. And we know today, as we here in the UK have been vaccinated from COVID, more people in the UK have been vaccinated than across the whole of the continent of Africa. So I want to say we know that this is a really profound moment. You know, one of the greatest victories of neoliberalism, I think, has been said, is not what it did to our structural economy and to our societies, but actually what it did to us is about our ability to believe that an alternative is possible. So we know that this moment requires a new vision of internationalism, solidarity, requires us to tell a very, very different story and build a very, very different vision for the future, and for a more fair and equitable transformation through these concrete policy solutions. And I'm going to just end by saying, you know, the words of Chico Mendes, the legendary Brazilian trade unionist environmentalist, you know, who was murdered because he opposed industrial agribusiness. He said, You know, ecology without class consciousness is simply gardening. And I think that is a really profound message we have to take out to this environmental movement at the moment, that tinkering around the edges is not the solution. This is the moment for us to be radical and more and profoundly ambitious to create the world that we want. Thanks.
Asad, thank you. Thank you with a hand on a heart. It's not just your analysis, but always remember the smile with which you deliver it, you know. So folks, we've only got about 5 minutes left or so. I really don't want to go into a lot of detail. We're starting to lose people because they're rushing away. Some of us are going to the other meeting, some of us need food and do other things. But if anybody wants to put their hand up, there's not that many of us left. Please do so now and ask a question. And just when I'm thinking about this, maybe some of the panelists might come back with, you know, 30 seconds, 1 minute of, actually, Declan, you go. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Asad. I just wanted to flag up that Asad had been incredibly modest in how he presented the work of the COP26 coalition and War on Want in particular. And I was organising with the Campaign Against Climate Change trade union group, and it filled the heart with joy that the trade union movement were coming in line with War on Want and friends there in Scotland in the organisation of the COP26 coalition, and it was very much the way forward in my view. And Asad talked about a movement of movements, and in a way he was a leader of leaders, but there is great scope for the trade union movement to persist within the environmental movement, and it's commonly misunderstood in the way in which trade unions are deemed to have a protectionist approach to the issue. There's many trade unions involved in this, and I'd just like to flag that up. And you know, I don't have a particular question because I think he covered everything, but I just wanted to reiterate for those present that the trade union movement is very much campaigning for climate justice across Britain and Ireland.
Thanks, Declan. Asad, do you want to respond to that?
I feel like I've talked a lot, so happy for maybe 2 or 3 contributions and others people to contribute. I know lots of people have done amazing work also on this same issue. Okay,
Bridget, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly, I thought that was, I thought that was an amazing presentation. I could have listened to you for another hour at least. So it's a pity that you felt it had to be rushed, and I know the time doesn't allow for it, but I really liked the way you presented the whole imperialist thing, the colonialism, because colonialism isn't dead, it's just in another form now. So it's really important to bring that out. And sometimes we can, because we're here in the global north, we can forget what's happening in the global south and the suffering that's going on there, much of it caused by the global north. So I just really think that's a huge part of the whole climate movement, and making people aware of that. So thanks for sharing all that with us.
Okay, thank you, Bridget, for that observation. Anyone else want to make a contribution or ask a question? If not, we could wrap up now. I'm sorry there hasn't been a lot of time for discussion, but let's just go around the panelists and the facilitators to see if they want to make a last 30-second intervention or something, or anyone else for that matter. Linda and Asad, yeah.
I just wanted to maybe ask Asad about a wee bit more about the Green New Deal, the global Green New Deal, and I know we put a link in the chat there, but just maybe how locally we can support it and feed into it.
Sure, happy to do that. So look, we didn't have a chance to speak about the alternatives, and there are incredible alternatives being built all around the world. Maybe not using the word Green New Deal, which is of course a very Anglo-Saxon northern word. You know, there are a recognition now increasingly in the global north that tackling to win the social license, we need to tackle inequality and well-being alongside the climate crisis, and that's really great. We're seeing that internationalism and the international aspect often gets forgotten about how do you connect these two together. And so we've been working both from bottom up and with movements across the world on, you know, setting out a framework, like what are the framework for a global Green New Deal? What are the key demands? How do we relate them and fight for them both at a domestic and a global level at the same time? How do we use our power in the global north in terms of ensuring the space exists for these alternatives? As we can talk about colonialism, every time an alternative has been built, it's been snuffed out, as we know, in the global south. So what does solidarity in this moment look like? So I put in the link. We're about to publish what that framework is. We're looking, of course, you know, that very much that approach of movement of movements. We need to be connected in a movement of movement here within the global north, but also that movement to movement needs to be connected with our movements to the global south, so that those struggles we're connected. And you know, we've done an amazing work, I think, with the trade union movement to begin to bring them and understand the climate crisis not as a carbon issue and not even just as but about the society and the economy we want to build. But we've got to make sure that it doesn't just talk about workers in the global north. I would say to the trade union movement, you've got to remember our slogan is workers of the world unite, not workers of England or workers of the UK unite. And often that expense of thinking about workers only within our own national frameworks is done at the expense, of course, of workers in the global south. So how do we build a win-win on these? So we've tried to look at what would you do around food, what would you do around material transition, what does fighting for a living wage and social protection public services look like, and what do we do particularly around, you know, using clothing as a way to engage and bring in new people way beyond the climate movement as a way of connecting and strengthening our movement. More than happy to send you some links on that.
Okay, folks, I don't see anybody burning to come in now, and I just want to thank everybody for turning up today. I know it's mid-January and it's like middle of the day or beginning of the evening, and so many of us have other things to be getting on with, but this has been so rich and so rewarding, and we've collected an awful lot of materials which we'll share with you as well, and let's keep the conversation going. I just want to finish with a quote of a favorite person of mine, you know, who unfortunately died far too young in 2020, just developing what Assad was saying there, you know, in terms of where is there hope in this planetary series of crises. And it's from David Graeber. And he said that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make differently. So on that moment of hope and truth, thank you so much for coming today, folks. And we'll send out some materials to everybody who joined.